Beaten Zone explores the cracks and seams of history, the stories that don't sit comfortably in textbooks or clean victory narratives. And one of the easiest things to overlook in war is the role of civilians, especially children, not just those caught in the crossfire, but those ordered to fight. My guest today is Heidi Langbein-Allen, co-author of Save the Last Bullet, her father, Willy's memoir. Nazis took Willy from his parents as a boy, exposed him to a compulsory system of indoctrination, and sent him into combat at 14 years old during the final days of World War II. He came face to face with the Soviet forces in brutal, close-range fighting. He watched classmates, also children, executed by the SS. He saw others crushed beneath Soviet tanks. And in the middle of that chaos, he was forced to make moral choices that many of us will never face in an entire lifetime. This matters because child soldiers are victims, period. They don't choose wars. They don't choose ideologies. They inherit decisions made by adults and institutions that never carry the consequences themselves. By 15, Billy was already carrying the wounds of war, physical injury, emotional trauma, and moral injury that would follow him for decades. He returned to a destroyed Germany and had to confront the truth of Nazi atrocities, reconcile his own survival with collective guilt, and find a way to live forward. What makes the story endure is not just what he survived, but what he did with it. Over a lifetime, Billy turned his experience, his guilt, and his wounds into something constructive for his family, his country, and the broader effort to rebuild a democratic Europe. Here's the bottom line. If you go to war, children will suffer in ways that none of us like to think about. But acknowledging this reality is necessary for us to make responsible decisions about going to war. We're going to dive into this space today. This is the Beaten Zone, and I'm John Mark Wilson. Okay. Hi, guys. John Mark here. I'm honored to be joined today by Heidi Langbein-Allen. Heidi, welcome to the Beaten Zone.
Thank you so much for having me. Very excited to be here, and thank you for allowing me to share my dad's story and talk to you.
Thank you. Well, the honor is ours. This is a great story. Heidi, if you could first tell us a little bit about yourself before we kick off.
Well, my name is Heidi, very German name. Actually, it's a Swiss name, but I was born in Germany, in Düsseldorf, and my mother was a Spaniard. My father was a German. And that is in itself something fairly extraordinary because when they got married in 1959, that did not happen. So that's another story. But I then ended up growing up mostly in France, in Paris, because my father, as you know, it's probably going to come out in this conversation, ended up working for the Foreign Service, for the Department of Defense of the country of Germany, for the Foreign Service, and was deployed as a diplomat to different countries. And at the time in France, during my formative years, he was with the European Space Research Organization, ESRO, and then after that with NATO.
Mhm.
So then I actually spent all of my childhood and youth in Europe, then moved to Spain because it was warmer and more pleasant to go to college. And yeah, and then I ran into an American soldier at some point, and here I
Here
am.
you are. That's great. And Heidi, a lot of folks will tell us a little bit about the book's co-author, Billy. Tell us a little bit about him and his background and kind of his overall career.
Yeah, so the book, Save the Last Bullet, is my father's memoir. Now, since my father had passed, basically Ghost wrote it. So I edited his memoir, and uh, he was a child soldier in the German army during World War II. He was taken from his parents at age 13 by the Nazis for indoctrination and to prepare him for the final days of the war with really no expectation of survival. So basically, they were being trained, these children were being trained as cannon fodder for when the time would come. The alleged reason was to protect the children from Allied bombing. So they removed them from the influence of their parents and from the church to be able to indoctrinate them further into the cause. So it served really two purposes. Right? The main stated purpose was for protection of the children, to convince the parents to let the children go. But the real purpose was to have them under their full control and use them as necessary, which they ended up doing with my father when the time came. So when he was 14, he was engaged in the German army in March of 1945, just before the end of the war, to the Eastern Front, which at the time was Austria already. And he was unaware. Of course, he was still a child. He was unaware exactly where he was or what he was doing in terms of the importance of the events that unfolded around him. And he was in the battle that was the precursor of the taking of Vienna by the Russians. So theirs was the last battle, the Battle of Wiener Neustadt, which occurred on or around the 1st of April of 1945.
It's an extraordinary story, and I'll just say up front, I read the book cover to cover. I read it in a single day. It was that good. And I'll give my personal endorsement. Our listeners should read it because it gives, we talk a lot in this podcast about, we like to explore cracks and seams of history. This is one of them. And it's easy for us to accept the broad narratives and the broad historical mythologies that we've been educated in our educational system. And we all have had relatives who've served in World War II. We're very proud of their service. But to truly critically study a war and to understand, you really have to study things on both sides. And in my view, it's a personal opinion, Willie is a victim. He's a victim of an institutionalized government program by the National Socialists to put children in the front to protect the regime. And it's a story that I think is very important in an overall study of World War II, is the plight of children soldiers. And so we're going to dive into Willie's story. And I really want to start, Heidi, with a conversation about indoctrination of children. So, according to the book, Nationalist Socialist ideology was very present in Willie's schooling from the very first day, literally his first day. How early did education really, for Willie, stop being about learning and start being about shaping loyalty?
Yeah, that's it's very interesting now, the manipulation of the young minds, and it's very effective. It is being used in in a lot of countries even today. We see it in authoritarian regimes, in particular, dictatorships, where the children um, are manipulated. The children's minds are manipulated into a certain direction, and basically they were influenced very heavily to listen only to one message,
Hmm.
and their minds are molded in that way. So one of the examples of that, and is in the book, is that after Hitler rises to power in 1933, and quickly declares a state of emergency, quickly takes over the parliament, and takes really absolute power. He had full control over society in the sense that he enacted laws to stop free thinking, really, to limit the amount of free agency people had by suppressing free speech and going after other political parties, and prohibiting public, protests and other
Hmm.
and even expressing opinions. So then they went um, to the schools, and what happened with the school books in particular is that they were rewritten.
Yep.
Whereas school book, and this happened around 1945, at the same time that the Nuremberg laws were enacted against the Jewish population, where they lost their citizenship as Germans. They started removing it's almost like neurolinguistic programming. They started removing wording that usually would point to church and
Hmm.
family and a God, and remove that wording to replace it with notions of fatherland, blood and soil, and the Führer being the source of ultimate truth, and the person to whom everybody should look up to, and should be grateful to, because he was the savior of the country.
Hmm.
And so my father started school, because my father was born in 1930, started school in 1936, when this had already happened, and the school books were already written in that fashion. So it was a relatively subtle influence. Nonetheless, it was already very cemented in the schools, and in the education they were receiving from the time that he entered school.
Yeah. What does it mean for a child to absorb ideology before they even possess the vocabulary to question it?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think they're not equipped. So a child believes what the adults tell him or her, naturally so, because their brains are not developed enough to have developed critical thinking abilities, right? I mean, the frontal cortex, in a young adult doesn't even fully develop till they're in their 20s.
Mhm.
So a child, and anybody who has children has experienced this, that when a child is, 4, 5, 6 years old, they believe that their parents are heroes and gods, basically. And anything that a parent or if an authority figure says is simply accepted as the truth. And I think that, not to go into biology, but the neural connections are being built to establish certain patterns, and that forms beliefs.
Mhm.
These are not thought processes as much as they are ingrained beliefs that are part of the neurological pattern of that person for the rest of their lives. So I believe that it's quite difficult to deprogram, right?
Yeah.
This
Yeah.
this because it's a belief, not a thought.
Right. Is this is an important thing for people to kind of put a pin in and to reflect upon, I think, because right now let's move to the modern time. Children today are exposed to social media. They're exposed to limitless sources of information, right? And so it's important for us to reflect upon this lesson in history that children who have a vacuum of stable, what I would consider be day to day, almost continuous influences in their lives are quite vulnerable to being shaped, to having a shaped worldview long before they have the biological capacity to question it, to be able to push back on it, and critical thinking skills, as you said.
Yeah. And critical thinking skills also need to be taught. So in authoritarian regimes, you see often that that is not something that is being taught to people
Yeah,
on purpose.
on purpose.
Because the goal is to create a population that's unquestioning of authority,
Mhm. That's right.
that will simply accept what is put in front of them.
Heidi, you hear a lot the term good Germans, right? And I appreciate the term. I appreciate the question where it comes from because it's as part of critical thinking, you need to ask those kinds of questions. I acknowledge that. However, sometimes I think it's very easy to drift into laziness, intellectual laziness, when people throw that term around because one can't really understand what it's like as a German living in Germany during that period of I guess it would be post Weimar Republic. And now you're entering into the National Socialist regime forming and taking control of all the government and the media and everything. Your Opa, your grandfather, was someone who saw problems. He had in the book, you said he had a vision for a dark period for Germany, and he started to publicly express some of his concerns in his community. And he paid a little bit of a price for it. Can you tell us a little bit about that? And then, in particularly, what sort of pressures were everyday Germans who maybe had concerns about what the regime was doing, but what challenges they had in terms of being able to express concern or to be able to push back or to form some sort of resistance?
Yeah. So and go the my great grandfather, Opa Johannes, whom you're talking about, did in fact express concerns, and this was in the early mid 30s, 34, 35, when the regime was starting to become much more controlling, and the propaganda, even though they didn't have social media,
Mhm,
was extremely strong.
mhm,
You had the media that they had then, radio, pamphlets, public speeches, etc. It was very clear that opinions that diverged from the government credo were not going to be accepted. He did express concerns, and in his case, they were farmers. So
mhm,
that side of the family were farmers. And there was another farmer, Mr. Kuppenborg, who had a large farm adjacent to my grandfather's, and he actually coveted that farm. So he found it very convenient to, in his forum with, I think he was, if I recall correctly, part of the National Socialist Party,
mhm,
spoke in his meetings about his neighbor, my great grandfather, having done bad things. And so immediately that tarnishes that person's reputation. This gentleman was well regarded. And so this was basically slander and defamation because it turns out my grandfather hadn't done these things. But immediately there was trouble for him. And so he ended up having to defend himself. Luckily, he was able to clear up the situation, but he was lucky because it could have gone very easily gone the other
Mhm.
way. And then the control became much more violent.
Mhm.
So any public protests were violently suppressed. You
Yep.
had the SA and then later on the SS, the basically quasi sort of personal paramilitary guards that would ensure that the law was obeyed.
Yep.
So anybody who expressed any opinions contrary to the regime would either suddenly find that nobody would go to their shop anymore, or they would lose their license, or they would get fired without explanation, so as to strongly discourage the person from continuing down the path of not agreeing with the regime. Then often the measures were more aggressive. So the
Yeah.
person disappeared or the person was publicly beaten, and many people who had differences of opinion with the regime, including Catholic priests and nuns in the thousands, were incarcerated. Communist Party, all of them were either killed or incarcerated or escaped. And so that in the Social Democratic Party as well was intimidated into submission. So it was really the violence, that we saw unfold, similar to certain things we see today. When, for instance, in Iran now, we can see unfolding public protests, and people are dying in the thousands because they're being murdered by their own military. Right, the military is being deployed against their own people. So that's what was going on. So people were simply afraid for their lives, and mostly, like any, I think, regular person, very concerned about their family members.
Mhm.
The head of the family would be extremely concerned about what would happen to their children, because then what would also happen during the war is that folks would be denied food stamps, which was another way to ensure that the person was basically beaten into submission. So it was extremely aggressive. Dissent was not tolerated in any way. And if a dissent was openly expressed, so I'm talking about people expressing opinions to each other. Oh, another thing is children were encouraged to snitch on their parents, right? Children in school were told to listen in to their parents' conversations. And if they felt that their parents expressing opinions that were not good, because the Führer, again, was our savior, and we had to have total and absolute loyalty to him. If they heard their parents saying something else, they needed to tell their teacher. So this was ingrained into little children. Everybody was encouraged to snitch and to whistleblow, and then whistleblowers were also rewarded for their efforts. So this created internal conflict and isolation between people. So it polarized the population. It isolated the population, which is an obvious part of the playbook of authoritarian regimes. Divide and conquer. People are isolated and are easier to control because they don't have a network.
Yep. Than Thank you for that. That's very insightful. Coming back to Willy, all these things that are happening are viewed through his eyes. Let's talk about an experience that really kind of captured my attention, which was when he saw a synagogue on fire as a child on his way to school before he really understood what it meant. And he was asking his father questions. And I guess later in life he would point to it and say that was the night of the Kristallnacht. So how did witnessing violence like that before he could really understand what was going on kind of shape his memory later in life as you were kind of talking to him?
Yeah. It's interesting because, of course, as many veterans, he did not speak about the war. So,
Mhm. Yep.
and I think that's common with veterans of war. They don't speak easily about the
Mhm.
events. And in particular, after World War II, the Germans in particular were, it was unspeakable. You couldn't speak of, the German side. in any way. And in fact, when my father did return alive, he was immediately told to never speak of it again, and basically to erase it from his memory.
Yeah.
And so, how did it shape him? I think that that's a trauma you carry with you for the rest of your life. As far as him being very very young, I know he was disturbed when he finally told me the story much later, after he'd retired and had time to reflect, I think, on his legacy. He agreed, because I'd been, bothering him about speaking up and telling us his story, at least for the family, because I thought it was important. It was important for not just for me and my family to know, but for people to understand, the events from the lens of the civilians and from the lens of children, from the lens of the people who experienced the pain and the suffering and the devastation, and not just from the history books.
Hmm.
And in the end, he relented, and so he left me 16 cassette tapes in German and sent them to my sister and to myself. He recalls being disturbed by the sight, and he just simply couldn't understand what happened. And when he asked his father, he simply didn't get answers.
Hmm.
His father told him, "I don't want anything to do with this. Don't ask any questions." And because also it was dangerous to talk about, right? Now, he didn't know this, but his father did. Like, if you got caught talking about any of this and expressing, God forbid, an opinion that, oh my God, this is really awful, well, that could immediately be construed as, oh, you think this is awful to burn a synagogue? Well, no, this is a great thing, right? So you must be a dissident, and you must be, a person who loves Jews. Of course, that would be in the immediate kiss of death, right?
Yeah. Yeah. You mentioned in the book, could you talk to us a little bit about, in addition to the propaganda and the indoctrination that you described, Willie was also exposed to what I would consider to be an institutionalized, militarized program. Can you tell us a little bit about young folk and Hitler Youth and how that was kind of structured in Willie's kind of education as he progressed towards being of soldier age?
Yeah, so I made a comparison with, the Boy Scouts
Uh-huh.
and the Cub Scouts organizations, right? To explain that to people. The organization, the Hitler Youth Organization, um, of course, was called something else before that. It was a, an outdoors association of kids, very much, a program that existed in many countries then and exists in many countries today, really to promote outdoorsmanship and physical education and the molding of young minds to understand nature and all these good things that the Boy Scouts try to promote. And it was exactly the same in Germany. Germans were always very fond of outdoor experiences, and it was a fully regular kids group organization. Hitler took it over, appropriated this organization to use it for his purposes. And there was a precursor organization to the Hitler Youth, which was called Jungvolk. This started with kids at age 10, and very similar to the Cub Scouts, so younger children would have this outdoor activity program that then would lead to the next step. So you'd have the Cub Scouts going into the Boy Scouts. Well, this would be the same thing. The young folk from 10 to 14, ages 10 to 14, would then basically graduate the kids into the Hitler Youth from ages 14 to 18. And during the war, the 18-year-old boys would immediately be conscripted into the military. What used to be a voluntary program became mandatory 1939 after the war started. So
Yeah.
the war was started in September 1st, or was declared September 3rd. And then shortly thereafter, those programs were no longer voluntary, they were mandatory. So a 10-year-old boy would automatically be enrolled in the Jungvolk. And there was a parallel organization for girls as well, which was also mandatory. So girls were enrolled into their Bund Deutscher Mädchen organization and were taught to support the fur by, the activities that women were allowed to do, which was, make sure you're a good housewife and support your husband who's fighting for the fur and produce a lot of children.
Yeah. I think that a lot of folks who haven't really studied it closely, when they hear the term Hitler Youth, they immediately think of children who, as you say, these are kids that are very ideologically driven to support the Fuhrer. What they don't, the next step of critical thinking is like, okay, so was this something that was on their own, voluntarily they gravitated towards? These are children. They were forced to go into it. I mean, a lot of people don't know that this was
Yeah.
a mandatory pipeline of indoctrination.
You absolutely had no choice. I mean, it was illegal. You would get in trouble as a parent if they found out that your child wasn't enrolled.
Mhm.
And so there are some stories about folks literally trying to flee Germany, many unsuccessfully so, because another thing that is not known is there's so many mechanisms, right, to control the population. First of all, to you manipulate their minds, but it's also these physical controls. And there was the exit tax. Folks, a lot of Jewish folks, of course, tried to get out. It's not like they didn't realize. A lot of them didn't understand that this would happen.
Sure.
Truly, they couldn't believe it, right? Because it was so just horrendous. The ones that did, and not just Jewish people, but Germans who disagreed with the regime, turned out they couldn't leave because the exit tax was so to move assets out of the country was 90%. So
Wow.
you would literally have to give 90% of whatever you were trying to get out of the country to the government to even be able to get out. And that's if you got lucky enough to get a passport, which, after a while you didn't anymore. And I'm talking before the war started. So this is leading up to the war, right? So there
Yep.
are many other mechanisms. And as far as the mandatory nature, yeah, my father was enrolled at age 10. That was it. I mean, you were in there. And he reported enjoying the activities. Of course, he's a kid. So now they're going to do outdoor activities, but the activities were very targeted. The kids didn't notice that. So what did he learn? Sharpshooting. He learned to do paramilitary marches with, patriotic songs, but that was fun, right? And then throwing grenades, not real grenades, they were wooden grenades, but it was basically it was a game. But
Mhm.
what they were doing is they were already training these children. And that was the 10 to 14-year-olds. And then of course the 14 to 18 became a lot more serious, right?
Yeah.
That's when they went into true programming.
I would absolutely join something like that as a young kid, as a young boy who likes
Yeah.
I used to love to go out to the woods and play war with my friends,
Yeah.
and, that's something it's very easy to see how a young boy could be very much attracted to something like that.
Yeah.
But even if they weren't, they were forced to. It was compulsory.
And it was not exactly, it was compulsory, it was not a choice. And then they did it in a very targeted way in terms of scheduling the activities like on Sundays so that the kids couldn't go to church because the church was always opposed to the regime and paid dearly for it, in particular the Catholic Church, which by the way, my family was Catholic.
Mm.
So they were literally not able to go to church, to Sunday services. And then they had the activities in a lot of the activities. And they started with, I believe, 2 or 3 times a week. And then it was every day after school. So basically, they were limiting the influence that parents could exert on their children should the parents not be wise enough to keep their mouth shut.
You mentioned earlier the, KLV program,
Yeah.
which was, as you very effectively described, it was separating the children from their families under the guise of protection. There was also a controlling element as well. And so in the book, you said that they were separated from their parents and caregivers, and they were doing their schooling in Lake Constance, I believe,
Hmm.
and, he was actually taken in by basically a foster family. If
Yes.
I that's probably
Yes.
my understanding of it. That, moment that you described where he's leaving the train station and he mentioned he did not have the opportunity to say goodbye to his mom and dad, that
Yeah.
broke me. That broke me. Could you
Yeah.
share a little bit about that moment and then kinda talk a
Yeah.
little bit about his experience in the KLV
Yeah.
program?
Yeah, the KLV program, so Kinderlandverschickung, which is, I guess loosely translated as Children's Country Relocation Program, was also purportedly voluntary until it wasn't.
Mhm.
And so when parents, again, so it was a program that specifically intended to protect city children from the Allied bombings. So in order to do so, they would separate them from their parents and put them in rural areas that weren't experiencing, much active war. So that was the stated goal. And of course, the KLV program started early on in the war, right? I think as early as 1940, and things got worse. And the Nazi regime needed more backup cannon fodder because they were losing, the men. They became more aggressive. And so the program, when parents, I guess, failed to muster enough enthusiasm for sending their children to an uncertain fate where they would lose complete visibility and control over their children because, there wasn't, you didn't have internet or cell phones, right?
Mhm.
You were lucky if you had a landline and you didn't use it. So those kids effectively would be gone. And that's exactly, of course, what the regime wanted, to remove them as much as possible from the influence of their parents. When they failed to muster this, enthusiasm, for instance, in the region my grandparents were at, North Rhine-Westphalia, the regional government made it illegal
Mhm.
to not send your kids to school. So if you did not send your children to school, well, I'm sorry, no, that was a federal. It was illegal to not send your children to school, right? So you had to, and that was, you could be imprisoned for it,
Mhm.
and you would be, in fact. So the North Rhine-Westphalian government shut down all the schools in 1943. Therefore, the program was still voluntary on paper, but the only way to not be imprisoned for violating the law of not sending your children to school was to put them in that program because there were no schools open anymore
Right.
in North Carolina. So that's how regimes manage to force people into doing things that they don't want to do.
Yep.
Right? So here's my father with his entire classroom. So this was very structured. They were incredibly well organized. So they would take entire classrooms with the teacher. And again, no choice here. It's not like it was optional. So everybody would leave with 20 kids perhaps, right? The teacher or a couple of teachers that would be nominated, and a Nazi handler. So a Nazi handler was there to perform surveillance on this classroom of boys. Girls also had their program, but they were separated, and it was less aggressive in that sense because boys were the primary target. The handler would report on a daily basis to headquarters all of the activities of that classroom with that teacher and the host family. Now, the host family, my father was lucky actually that he got a host family because some of these kids were sent directly just to camps. He actually, for a while, now he was sent to a camp. In the end, he ended up in a camp as well. But in the beginning, he still had sort of a family structure. Those host families had no choice either.
Mhm.
They were just simply assigned a child. Whether they could afford the child or not, they were not provided any assistance, monetary or otherwise. They were simply ordered to take in these children. So the family that my father ended up with already had, a horde of kids. I think it was 6 or 7 children in the family, and they were not wealthy people. So that was an added burden on them. But that's how that unfolded. And my grandmother was able to visit a couple of times,
Mhm.
but then soon thereafter lost that contact because my father then was moved with his
Yep.
classroom to a remote village in the mountains, into basically a camp.
Yep. Did your father talk about when he was in the camps? Did he talk about malnourishment, homesickness among the children, and the toll it took on them?
Well, it was really, it's awful for a child to be separated from their parents and from any just support structure, and of course that was also the point, to then have them become the Nazi handlers, became their family, their support group, because there was nothing else, right? So they had to rely on each other and on this new family structure, right, which was the Nazi regime, right, and the SS and the Nazi handlers. So it was awful because my father was so homesick that he actually escaped at one
Mhm.
point. He escaped his host family with the knowledge of his host family. They supported him. And he did something extremely dangerous. He didn't know how dangerous it was. And another thing I'd like to mention is also how ignorant sometimes people were of the true motivations and the true restrictions of the system. My grandfather, who was employed by the Reichsbahn, which is the railways, the German railways, was able to get tickets. And so he sent a ticket to my father in the belief that my father was actually free to leave and visit them,
Mm.
which was not the case. He was unaware of it. So my father actually knew this, and he took the chance because he was so homesick he couldn't bear it anymore. And at Christmas time, he literally jumped on a train and escaped notice by hiding under, ladies' skirts. Literally, he escaped the notice of the would monitor actively whether people were trying to sneak into trains to go anywhere without permission, in particular people who were soldiers and or Hitler Youth weren't allowed without permission to go anywhere. And Hitler Youth wasn't allowed to travel alone anyway.
Yeah.
So he took a big chance. And in the end, he got caught. He was able to get away with not too big of a punishment because of his young age, and they just sent him back, and basically that was okay. Then once he was in the camps, and this was, we're talking early 45 already, when he ended up in the mountain camp, where he had already been told at that point that he and two of his schoolmates had been selected for the great honor to lay their lives down for the Führer. So they were handpicked by the SS in late 44 when they were still in Constance with the foster family in school. The SS showed up and picked out the biggest kids, the strongest kids, and my father happened to be one of them, and told them, gave them this news. They said, "You are being bestowed a great honor to die for your country, and you will get military training for 2 months, and then you will be put back in school until you are called upon to do your duty."
Yep.
So this is what my father was faced with. And then when he was in 44, when he got to that mountain village in 45, everything had broken down in terms of structure. So there was no infrastructure left. There was no food. There was all the livestock had been killed. There was no farming per se anymore happening. There was hunger and hunger to the point where these children were only fed beet soup day in and day out, and it was starvation, and so they were stealing food wherever they could find it. And we had that situation, that is described in the book, where one of those poor kids, they used to swipe all of them. They'd go in a little group and try to, steal food from the butcher and wherever they could find food because they were literally starving. And one kid made the mistake of breaking into the SS depot. That they all found out that was stealing from the SS was punishable by a death, and even at that age. And the SS caught the boy red-handed and then made the other kids, including my father, watch the next morning as he was executed by a firing squad.
It's a poignant moment in the book. It was really Vili's first exposure to, that sort of violence face to face. And it's almost a foreshadowing of what was to come in the poor lad's life. So, as you mentioned, it's 1945, and the war is pretty much at this point, it's over. Willy chose to go into the Wehrmacht versus going into the SS, which I do want to talk to you about that a little bit. This is a 14-year-old kid, right, who had the judgment when he was offered the opportunity, you can go one way or the other. He selected to go to the Wehrmacht instead of going into the SS. Did you ever talk about like what I always thought to myself, wow, what amazing judgment for a young man of that age who'd been exposed to all that propaganda, who'd been exposed to all that indoctrination, and yet he had the judgment to say, I'll just go be a normal soldier.
Yeah, so they were not given the choice to not go into the military. Obviously, they were told you will go. But they did, surprisingly, and I would assume that it's because all of the different branches of the military desperately needed people. So they were given the choice of which branch of the military to go into. And so they were offered the choice to go either to the SS or the Army or the Air Force or the Navy. And so my father and the other two boys immediately picked the regular armed forces or the SS because my father always, in speaking about it, remembered how creepy he thought these people were. He said
Mhm.
them were just very individuals that made your skin crawl is how he described it. And
Yep.
then of course he saw it, you know, it so he knew he had made the right choice, right? When he saw the SS execute his schoolmate in front just for swiping, you know, I think it was a half a pound of butter and
Yep.
a little bit of ham. And he still shook his head, and you know, when he did talk about it later, much later in life, just still you could see the pain in his face going, just for a little bit of butter. Right.
Yeah.
But it was very clear, right? It was ruled by fear and intimidation, and it was absolutely the point that the SS was making. You know, dissent will be punished swiftly and will not be tolerated, and the punishment is death. So you will obey.
Yep. So Willie joins the army, and he's 14 years old. I can't emphasize that enough. And he's sent to the outskirts of Vienna to participate in the defense against the Soviet breakout during the Ukrainian campaign.
Yes.
And so as he arrived at the battlefield, and I'll pull a quote because it stuck with me. He said his hero's blood ceased to exist once he arrived to the front. Can you share with us a little bit about what was going through his mind at that point?
I can't help but think that he was probably absolutely terrified. So they were just basically dumped at the whatever the front was there, and told to dig foxholes and for themselves, and they were given 4 Panzerfaust, which is a bazooka like
Mhm.
you know, anti-tank weapon. It's a single fire weapon. You can only fire it once. It was extremely effective and had great precision, but it was one. You could only fire one time. So they were given 4, and that was it. And then they were given a pistol, a hand pistol, and a machine gun.
Yeah.
And so they were told to wait for the Russians to show up, which of course the Russians did, you know, pretty quickly. And what he told me is that he was told 2 things. He was told, you know, during this training with the Panzerfaust, he was told to wait for the tank to be at exactly 20 meters distance. So they had to calculate visually the distance at which the tank was from them in order to make sure that the weapon would actually hit the tank and explode the tank. Because if they were too close, they would probably get run over by the tank. The tank was any closer, and if it was too far, they would miss the target. And so that was an enormous amount of pressure in terms of, you know, visually trying to gauge, you know, how far the tank is. So he established some visual cue. It was a rock at
Mhm.
which he thought more or less, you know, that would be the distance at which he had to fire. But you know, pretty soon the tanks arrived, and they were the famous Russian tanks. I forget the right now. I'm having
I
a
think it's
blank.
T-34 if I'm not.
T-30 something, yes.
Mm.
And they were very, very famous. They were very agile tanks. They
Yep.
were all terrain, and there were he just recalls them being just an overwhelming number of them. So you know their, you know, command knew full well that 4 Panzerfaust wasn't going to be enough. So they had no expectation that these kids would survive.
Yeah.
And the second thing he was told is to keep the last bullet for himself, which is why I titled the book "Save the Last Bullet." He was told to save the last bullet in the pistol for himself because being taken prisoner by the Russians was a fate worse than death, because he would be tortured before he would get killed.
For folks listening in the book, it's a very gripping and emotional story that Heidi shares about Willie's first encounter with the Soviets. And honestly, Heidi, the fact that you're even here today is a miracle.
It's true.
I'm sure you think about that quite often. I don't want to go into too much detail because I do want people to experience it for themselves, and also, you know, I don't want there's no goodness that comes out of getting into graphic detail about all the things that happened. But what this young boy experienced on the battlefield, seeing his friends, guys like to his right and to his left, you know, being crushed by tanks. It's a lot for a 14-year-old. And I think you and I talked on our prep call, the things that he experienced as a 14-year-old in just like a segment, like a fraction of his 14th year of life, 0.9% of people in the world never have to experience. And he experienced it as a child. It is extraordinary. There is a thing I want to talk about, which is that he had an up close encounter with a Soviet soldier. who was also a child.
Mhm.
Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, it's just a very, that's just the tragedy of war, right?
Mhm,
That he had to make that choice
mhm.
to kill or be killed,
Yep,
because that's the choice you have. And that's a not and that's the only choice you have. You don't have a choice about being there,
mhm,
because that's already been decided for you.
absolutely.
And so he didn't listen. He didn't listen to maybe the one time my father actually had pretty good common sense, I think. And made some good decisions that, whether it be good judgment or luck, right, saved his life. But in this case, he had in fact run out of ammunition. He had fired his four Panzerfaust, and hit the four targets. So he hit all four tanks, and so he had really good aim. Certainly that helped him. Fired, all the ammunition that he had for his machine gun, and was left, and then the pistol and was left. He stopped, so he had one bullet left. And so he decided to get the heck out of Dodge. So he could see complete devastation. I'm assuming it was complete chaos, as a battlefield would be. I have no idea how anybody ever gets out alive, because you have to be disoriented.
Yeah,
So I presume he knew more or less where to retreat to, and jumped out of the foxhole. And the moment he jumps out, the other kid is in front of him, this Russian soldier with a bayonet trained at his gut. And then it had to have happened literally in a split second. But he said that's one of the things he recalled clearly, was looking into that kid's eyes and realize that he was maybe his age. He was a kid just like him. But that was the 1 second. So and this all happened simultaneously. He pushed off with his machine gun, diverting the path of the bayonet to his leg instead of his gut, which is what saved his life. And he almost bled to death from the injury to his leg, because the bayonet sliced his leg open. But he lived to tell. But at that, all in simultaneously, he drew his gun and shot the Russian soldier in the head.
yep. Um, yeah, and thank you for sharing that, because I know that, and thank you for documenting that, because again, like, we don't, on this podcast, we try not to judge history. We just try to sit with it. And it happened. And this was a war at this point that involved children.
Mhm.
Villy talked about receiving the Iron Cross Second Class. The context, what I kind of pulled from the subtext of what you wrote, was that was not something that he was particularly proud of at that point. From a historical perspective, it's interesting because you mentioned that Hermann Goering actually presented the Iron Cross to him and his teammates. I find that Villy's kind of reflection on that reflected a lot about a lot of veterans feel about their awards that they receive in combat.
Hmm.
The ones who that I've spoken to that receive awards for valor typically downplay awards. And I think it's because what they go through, the experience they have, the horror, because it always involves trauma and horror, is what they carry, not the ribbon. Is that
Mhm.
accurate? Did I pick up on that subtext correctly?
Yeah, 100%. 100%. 'Cause I think perhaps soldiers, I don't know, right? I could
Mm,
only just judge from my father. It's what you say. It's like, they went through this horrible experience and somehow plowed through it, and came out alive at the other end, and some of the others didn't.
mhm.
And now they get, rewarded for that somehow with an award, and it's like, well, this wasn't supposed to happen in the first place, right? So at the time, they were completely worn out, and dispirited and really hopeless at this point. I mean, what was left of his unit was decimated. There are just a few people left, and Hermann Goering's effort, which continued, right? So the Nazi propaganda machine continued, right, till literally the bitter end, because Hitler had made it very clear, and those were the marching orders, that it was victory or death. You were not supposed to be alive. If you weren't victorious, you should be dead, right? And we see that unfolding, at the very end, very clearly, where any stray soldier who was separated from his unit and happened to, poor lad, be out there on his own lost, would get picked up by the SS and executed as a traitor. And so they weren't technically supposed to be alive. They weren't even technically supposed to be retreating. So this effort of Goering, and his acolytes to provide these medals, and was to try to boost the morale and make the troops still believe in the cause, and that they were still fighting on, and either win or go down in glory. And so that was the point of these awards, right?
Yep, of course. So at this point, I'll be simplistic. It's a retreat at this point.
Oh yeah, yeah.
And what I kind of picked up from the book is that there was a motivating factor in terms of their units at this point was avoiding capture by the Soviets and trying to make their way to the American lines. What sort of like is that? Can you talk to us a little bit more about that fear of like being captured by the Soviets, and why they were so motivated to make it to the American lines?
Well, I think that was well known, right?
Mhm,
And that was certainly, well, not just well known, but also advertised, if you will, by the Nazi regime, that you didn't want to get captured by the Russians.
mhm,
It was, because of the history, the loaded history, right? There
right.
was a pact between Russia and Germany, and they were allies and did horrible things together. And then basically Germany betrayed Russia by invading it. So and cost Russia enormous casualties, right? 20 million people in Russia died. So there was certainly no love lost. And it is true that Russians were extremely harsh in their treatment of prisoners, if they even did leave them alive, and not very many
Yeah.
were left alive, and were in fact tortured. So that fear was very real. So nobody wanted to be stuck in the Russian zone. And so with the intelligence, that little intelligence that they had, his command, his lieutenant, with these the ham radios that they had,
Mhm.
found out that apparently, yes, it was the situation was extremely dire, and that if the Allies won, they would divide up the country right into control zones. And the rumor was, they knew where the Russian control zone was going to be, and where the American the control zone would be, and where the demarcation line would actually be. And that is where they made their way to in a hurry, with just a couple of weeks really left in the war. They didn't know this, of course, but they clearly understood the sense of urgency. So they retreated as quickly as they could through, completely destroyed roads. I imagine, that the path was very impassable at best. But they made their way to a town in Austria
Mhm.
where this demarcation line was supposed to be, which was basically, the demarcation line was a river. So if you made it north of the river ends, you would be hopefully safely in the American zone. And if you stayed south of that, then you would be stuck in the Russian zone. And so they understood they would still, if it went that way, that the Allies won, it's not like the Americans were going to be nice to them, but they had some chance of survival.
Yep.
And that's the belief they ran with. And so they did just barely make it. Right? They didn't know they just barely made it, but they literally made it by like one day.
Yeah. For folks at home, I suggest you get the book and you check out. There are some pretty vivid and traumatizing moments as they're making their way. The unit is making its way to where they thought the demarcation line was going to be. Just some
Yeah.
atrocities that were committed, presumably by the Soviets, but atrocities could have been conducted by the SS as well on German citizens, on Austrian citizens that Billy saw with his own two eyes. What I took from that was just a complete breakdown of battlefield discipline at that point. It was really more about survival. One of the things that I wanted to ask you about was his first contact with the Americans, his unit's first contact with the Americans. I don't want to say it's humorous because there's nothing funny about it, but as a soldier, you kind of see like a gallows humor in like the fact that he got into a firefight after the war was over, and when he got back to his unit, and he said, "Hey, the allies are over there," and they said, "Bro, the war is over. Like, what are you doing?" And he had this moment of like the randomness of war. Like, just at one moment there's a war and we're fighting, and the next moment we're not fighting anymore. And he really realized like how ridiculous this whole thing is. Could you talk about his first contact with the Americans a little bit?
Yeah. It was, I guess, slightly humorous. Well, my father had a very, very good sense of humor. And I think
He did.
that
He did.
that was part of what saved him. I think people with certain mental makeups sometimes are a little bit more resilient.
Mhm.
And my father, I think, his sense of humor and also his high level of intelligence helped him, helped him make good decisions. So, but that was, yes, that was kind of almost funny because he didn't. I mean, they made it to the demarcation line and were exhausted and were taken in by families, and in this case my father spent the night at some lady's house, and not that the population, the civilian population, had any choice either, so
Right.
they had to take in the soldiers. Anyway, he was, she fed him a meal, and so he got a night's sleep. His pants were torn. I mean, just the usual thing, right? Exhaustion. And so but they put on their full battle gear the next day, and they're going to do exercises. So, because their commanders, whoever was still left, was trying to still maintain that discipline,
Yep.
right? That literally had broken down everywhere. And so he's in with, he's got helmet and weapons, everything. And then there's a break, right? It's the lunch break. And so this young girl from, the village just talks to this, well, her and I think a group of them start talking to the young soldiers. And, she offers him to give him a tour of the town. And he's ecstatic because he's a 14-year-old boy. And here's a girl who's maybe, I don't know, 20, even paying attention to him. So he thought that was just amazing. So, she takes him out to take a tour and she's, talking away. And then he turns a corner and there is this American Jeep with 4 soldiers in it. And then I guess they were just hanging out, but they had, the machine guns, and I can't remember what it was called, a quad or
Yeah.
something where they had, machine
Right.
guns trained at everything. And so this was not like a non-threatening situation. But basically, it's one of those situations almost like in the movies, right, where they all freeze. So the American soldiers weren't expecting to see a German soldier in full battle gear show up in the middle of this town square that was, it's just this little sleepy village. And he was certainly not expecting to see the Americans. And he froze. He didn't take any action, which probably saved his life. And what's bizarre, right, is that the Americans just, when they saw him, within a few seconds, decided to leave.
Hmm.
They just turned the Jeep, they left. And he ran, of course, that's what he would do, ran toward his, to his lieutenant to tell him the Americans are here. And that's when the lieutenant said, "We just found out the war's over." And he just sat down on the ground, right, and said, exactly what you say. It's just this absurdity. It's like, wait, I'm supposed to fight to the death up until this morning, and now you tell me, okay, game over, and now you don't do anything, right?
Yep.
Now it's to lay down your weapons and you're done. So it just very shocking.
Yep. And on the topic of laying down your weapons, and I think this is something that only like a soldier, I'm sorry, any service member, doesn't matter what branch you're in, can really identify with. It's something that resonated with me. Him giving up his pistol when he was being processed for internment by the Americans, he described it as a deeply emotional. That pistol represented his survival, and it really became part of his identity. And I think it really speaks to just the unique gravity of combat. Like, he really had a hard time giving up his pistol, not for no other reason, not because he just didn't want to give it up because that was his protection. It represented his survival. And this is a 15-year-old child at this point. This remarkable moment in the book, Heidi.
Yeah, in fact, he was still 14. So he
He was
turned
still 14 at
15.
the time. I'm
He
sorry.
turned 15 a few days later on May
Yeah,
12th, right? The war
yeah,
officially ended on the 8th. And he had to give up his pistol on his way to being led to the American internment camp, which his German unit had agreed to give themselves up to. And yes, so and I'll never understand it because I'm not a soldier, but yes, it represented his survival. It did, in fact, have saved his life. And I think a soldier regards his or her weapon as just almost an appendage of him, of herself, right?
yeah,
And his father, my grandfather, had kept his service weapon.
right.
He had his pistol, and he knew that his father had his service pistol, and it was his proudest possession. And my grandfather, that's also part of the story, lost that weapon, of course, and everything they owned because of the firebombing of their town. So they lost everything they had. They they were very lucky to get away with their lives. And so there was nothing left. It's almost like it's complete dispossession and just evisceration, right, of everything that a human being sort of clings to in life.
Yeah.
And so he had to give it up. And he was in the convoy. So they were on their way to the internment camp. And his comrades told him, look, if you keep this pistol, they're going to kill you. They're not going to ask questions. They're going to shoot you and then ask questions.
Yeah.
Just get rid of it. And so that's when he threw it
Yeah.
over the side.
I think a lot of, you mentioned earlier, like the alternative was to be captured by the Soviets. And obviously that's not what you wanted. American internment camps at this point, were very minimalist. They weren't clean. They weren't well stocked with food. And I think it would be unreasonable for me at this point to cast judgment on that because it is what it is. It was right after a major war. That's context. What your father experienced in a camp, it wasn't a fancy hotel. It was humiliation, sickness, hunger. You talked about him being deloused like he's a prisoner, which he was. What did that do to him? This is a guy that had been indoctrinated into strength and pride. And now he's facing this very rapid turn in the American internment.
Yeah. Well, as you say, war is ugly, right? And nobody's nice
Right.
to each other. And they were prisoners. Well, they were interned persons because, that was another awkward thing.
Yeah.
They weren't considered POWs, prisoners of war, because they had been taken prisoner after the war ended. And I guess legally, you're not a prisoner of war, you're an interned person at that point. And you're right. The internment camps were literally a piece of, just grass somewhere, somewhere outdoors with some barbed wire, right? And guards. And that was about it. There were no facilities. They were literally just in an area that was guarded so that they couldn't escape outdoors. And that was the only thing that was really there in terms of structure. Right? They had some water troughs and they were sleeping out on the ground. They got issued, I think, a small blanket, and that was about it. So that's what the camp was. There was no structure. It was simply some outdoor area that was fenced in.
Yeah. He talked about a couple of encounters with Americans at the internment. Some of them were positive, some of them were very negative. We won't get into too much detail. One thing that kind of stuck with me was he had a meeting with black soldiers. And I thought that was really interesting. And could you share a little bit about that encounter and kind of like what that meant to him over the long term of his life?
I think that was one of those seminal moments, right, in people's lives where he's later in life, when he explained it to me, he said, the black soldiers, he says, first of all, they seemed, to be just regular people.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was contrary to all of the indoctrination by the Nazis, who had dehumanized all minorities, not just Jews, but also blacks, gypsies, and other ethnic groups as subhuman. And the second thing he got out of it is that the American soldiers that were black were the only ones who were actually human
Mm-hmm.
to them.
Yeah.
Who behaved in a manner where he felt treated like a human being.
Yeah.
He said the black soldiers even told him at one point, because my father spoke English. So my father was very talented with languages. He spoke 7 languages. I was never able to catch up with that. I speak
Wow.
5.
That's impressive.
Yeah, it's a family thing, I guess. And so he had picked up English immediately. So he spoke it, I guess, relatively well. So he was the only one able to communicate, and he was the official translator for all of the German prisoners there. And so he was able to communicate, and the black soldiers told him, look, we know what it's like to be treated like, like very poorly.
Yeah.
We understand. And they would, give him cigarettes and, just have some human contact.
Yeah.
That he didn't experience anywhere else.
Yeah, it was a very interesting part of the story, and I'm grateful that you recorded that. So but last question, and we're going to really about the internment, and we're going to pivot towards kind of the rest of his life. There was a moment where the GIs were basically showing him pictures of the atrocities that were committed at the concentration camps. And I understand why they did that. And it was something that was directed from the very highest levels as part of the process to connect the dots, everything that had happened up to that point in the minds of the soldiers. And so at that point, he in the book, he connected those dots, Kristallnacht, yellow stars, up until that. How did he process that once he saw it? I think originally there was some disbelief, but then ultimately it settled in. It's like, wow, everything that I had been told was wrong and misleading. Can you talk to how a 14-year-old processes something like that?
No, not well. So he, his entire worldview was upended so I believe that was pervasive. So, the Americans would show images of the Holocaust, of the concentration camps, the emaciated people and just the awfulness to the soldiers. My father and his comrades didn't believe it. They believed that was propaganda. It was American propaganda against the Germans. They couldn't believe. They said, no, it's too horrific. It's ridiculous. It's not true. It can't be. This is a lie.
Mhm.
And and I think that was very much for those Germans who didn't know. For those who weren't actively involved in concentration camps, that was the reaction
Mhm.
when they saw those pictures. It couldn't possibly have happened. Nobody could do this, right? And so, long story short, after he finally makes it home, not without, a lot of stuff happening in between, he finally does make it home. And he eventually gets reincorporated back into regular society and into school because, they've got to reincorporate soldiers, back into civilian society. And that happens everywhere. And so these kids were school kids. So, we're talking young men who need to graduate high school. So when he went back to school, and back home is when he started truly putting, connecting the dots, putting two and two together.
Yeah.
And that's when he asked, one of the two important things happened. He listened to his teachers literally extolling the virtues of democracy when months before that they were extolling the virtues of the autocratic regime of Hitler. The same people. So, that immediately was a breakdown in his mind. It's like, well, okay, I can't trust anything or anybody because I know what you were saying 6 months ago. And now you're saying the exact opposite. So what do I believe? Which of this is the truth, right? And then he did finally sit down with his mother because his parents didn't want to speak about anything,
Mhm.
and they had lost everything. And he asked the question about the Jewish family, right? So the Jewish family neighbors, and I'm not going to go into too much detail, but they ended up, destitute. And of course, the father was sent to the concentration camp. The mother, who was German, Aryan, meaning non-Jewish, had refused to divorce her husband, which it could have been punishable by death and was at the end of the war in 45, but not immediately. So they were punished. Now, she and the child, who was considered pardon my language, but a bastard, was sadly completely dispossessed and disenfranchised, and they were refused food stamps, and they basically tried to starve them out or,
Yeah.
have them just die on their own. Whereas then it became so dangerous in 45, 44, no, 44 and 45, they were rounding them up, the remaining ones up that hadn't quite escaped yet this punishment, and we're going to either put them in concentration camps or execute them. So my grandparents, who were friends with these folks, took at great danger of their own lives, hid the woman and her child, who was my father's little friend, in the coal cellar, and they all survived miraculously. So they made it. And so he asked my father, just all he knew before he went into war was that, suddenly, and this, again, he was separated from his parents at age 13. So in that sort of 9, 10 to 13-year period, he realized he wasn't seeing his friend anymore.
Yeah.
And kind of suspected, right, what was going on. He figured it out by then. He had seen the stars, and he had asked, well, why does everybody say the Jews are bad people? And he just didn't get answers. And he asked what happened. And that's when his mother told him the story. She said, no, it's all true. They've, took, Mr. Grünebaum to the concentration camp. We tried to save mom and child. Everything you've heard is true. And
One
that's who he then 'Cause, that's his parent. So
Yeah.
I think that was the final point where he internalized the fact that it was all true, and then he was devastated. He went into a deep depression. He got very angry because he felt that he had been made complicit into something he had no control over.
Yeah.
I would have never chosen.
In the book, you describe brilliantly, I might add, because it captured me, his emotions as he comes back to his town after the war. And, context matters. There's no social media, there's no email. He had no contact with his parents. It was complete blackout from the moment that he went to go fight. And during his story, he was kind of like thinking about worst case, like what's happened to my family. Have the Allies firebombed like our community? Are my parents alive? And so now he's coming back home and he has those thoughts in his head. He doesn't know what to expect when he hits the ground. And he hits the train station and the landscape of his town was completely different. And you describe his mind as he's walking towards his home. And it must have been gut wrenching for Villy as he approached his home and saw the emotions that must have been going through his head at that point. I can't imagine as a 52-year-old man being able to deal with that, much less a 15-year-old boy.
Yeah, and I can't relate other than through, his words. You're right. So there was no social media, there was no communication. He had no idea. He found out on the train ride to his hometown from a fellow traveler that his town had been destroyed almost completely. So it had been destroyed to, I think, 85% destroyed. He didn't know that. He found out on the train. So I can only imagine his thought process. He may have thought they were all dead, like he was going to find nobody alive.
Mhm.
And then he exits the train station and yes, indeed, the town is completely destroyed. He couldn't even get his bearings. The only way he got his bearings was because the church, the Catholic church, and the train station were still while partially bombed, were still standing. So he got his bearings from there and tried to make his way through the rubble to find where his house should have been, and found a pile of rubble.
Yeah.
And so apparently they had put in poles with street numbers and names to orient people as to where, to the extent possible, to where these homes were located. So he found the area. And then he saw an area that was less destroyed. So there were some areas, of course, were still standing. So he started recognizing buildings. He pretty much collapsed, right? He started crying because I think he thought that all was lost.
Yeah. Your Opa, as you mentioned, your grandfather, was a World War I veteran. And as you mentioned, he was very proud of his service. And when Villy actually laid eyes on him and confirmed that he was alive, there was a tough moment for the young lad as he reconnected with his father, and we would have some challenges. Can you talk a little bit why you think that there was so much difficulty with Billy kind of reintegrating and connecting with his dad? Because it's something that I think a lot of veterans can actually relate to in many ways.
Only child.
Mm,
So and what I find, and this is just a generalization to me and personally, that it seems to converge with my father's thinking, is that, in particular men tend to turn fear into anger. And so when my grandfather saw my father, emaciated as he was too, because he didn't even recognize him, right? My father was 6 feet tall and he was like 90 pounds. So he was probably unrecognizable. So when I think he probably recognized him by his voice, right? So when my grandfather saw him, he was not equipped to deal with that. And I would believe because my grandfather was in World War I and was in the trenches with the mustard gas. I mean, and Germany, had a catastrophic loss. So he had, I would think my grandfather had massive PTSD.
of course. Yeah.
And when he saw his son, he just couldn't, he reacted with anger. I
Mhm.
think he was in his mind, what my father says is that he must have been so overwhelmed with emotion that he got basically angry in terms of like saying, son, how could you put us through this? How could you put me through this? How could you have done this to us? As if it were his son's fault.
Right.
Right. And so, as you know, that in the story tells that my grandfather walked away and didn't want anything to do with his son for a long time.
Yeah. Villy used a term that caught me, um, that stuck with me, and the term is damned generation. And what he was describing was like, well, his dad was a World War One veteran. He's a World War Two veteran, and they both experienced this horrible experience. And we all know what happened after World War One. The German economy, went in a very bad place. There were a lot of bad things that happened, and obviously World War Two, the destruction. And it was, to me, it was a very poignant moment where it's like you start thinking about your legacy and so forth. Did Is that something that kind of propelled Villy as he now focused, his life towards the reconstruction of Germany? Do you think that was something that drove him, that inspired him to really commit the rest of his life to making Germany the country that it is today? Because I dare say that, looking at his professional career after the war, he seemed to be dedicated the rest of his life to really doing just that.
Yeah, and he did. He did, but he didn't make that decision,
Mhm.
at age 15,
Right.
right? He It took a while for him to process, the events and what that meant to him, and emotionally
Mhm.
get through this. Well, yes, eventually, and through the help of a British soldier, he was able to sort of glimpse hope again, because he was very depressed and very hopeless for a while,
Mhm.
because he saw no redemption, no solution. And well, in part, it was the Joint Chief of Staff's proclamation 1067. I think it was Truman said, specifically wrote later that Germany was to be an agrarian state, and it was not to be reconstructed in any way. That, of course, changed maybe within a couple of years. Within a couple of years, a year, 2 years, the Allied forces realized that Germany needed to be reconstructed in terms of just infrastructure, because that and only that would help the reconstruction of the rest of Europe back to just functioning,
Right.
right, as a society. And so things did change, but in the beginning, it was very, very harsh, and there was no fraternization. My father, and the region he was in, was the British controlled area. And so fraternization was prohibited for a while, but then they loosened that up a bit, right? And so in I think mid 46 or 47, they were allowed to have some interaction with the British soldiers, with the German population. And so they established some interactions with the civilian population, such as sports organizations and youth groups. And so my father ended up joining a soccer team
Mhm.
that was run by the British, and it was a soccer team for secondary schools, right, for teenagers. And that is where he met the British soldier, who perhaps he realized my father spoke English very well, was a bright kid, and so just started talking to them, and in particular to my father, about the reconstruction of Germany. That yes, that was going to happen, and he could play a role in that, in reconstructing his country, and that he told him that they needed kids like him, right, to do that. And also, I think, just put in his mind that notion of a unified Europe, right? That budding concept that then led to NATO and to the European Union eventually.
Yep.
And so as my father then started coming out of his depression and realizing that, there was a life after this and that he could do something, he then went to law school, and did at that point determine that he was going to make sure, he couldn't change the past, but perhaps he could contribute to change in the future, and that he was going to dedicate his life to ensuring that these horrible things didn't happen again. And so he became a lawyer. He worked for the German Department of Defense in the Foreign Service, and did get the Medal of European Valor or Merit, European Merit, awarded to him in 1979 by the then Vice President of Belgium, for the furtherment of democracy in Europe.
Inspiring. So inspiring. Because we hear all the time about how from the American perspective, how the GIs returned home and they basically built the country the modern country of the United States. That's well known. I think it's important that, after the war is over, there were a lot of Germans, the ones who survived, rebuilt their country as well.
Yep.
And they built Germany into a very vibrant and very influential democracy in the heart of Europe and
Mhm.
contributed to this idea of a unified Europe. And, with the exception, I guess, of Ukraine and the Balkans, there really hasn't been conflict, major conflict on European soil. I'm not a historian. I might have missed something.
Yeah. Well, certainly not at all in Western Europe. So we've seen, we saw Yugoslavia, unfortunately.
Yep.
That was the conflict. So it's always been on the eastern
Yep.
side, in closer proximity to Russia, right?
Yep.
Central, getting close to Central Asia. So it's Eastern Europe, Central Asia, areas such as now we see the
Yep.
conflict, right, with the Ukraine.
I want to wrap up before we pivot to a little bit about you. I want to wrap up our talk about Billy with one question. And this is, what should people who study World War II and maybe even study Billy's story be most careful not to simplify?
That's a good question, and I think it would just apply universally to all wars. And I think that that's basically what your podcast is about: is that to examine all elements and all sides of the war to get the full picture.
Hmm.
And I think what we see is inevitably in every case is that wars are fought. They're directed by interests that are geopolitical, interests that have to do with power, money, power, influence. And but the people who fight the wars are regular people,
Yeah.
and the civilians who sit on the sidelines are not sitting on the sidelines. They are the ones who take the brunt of the experience because they experience the dehumanization, the brutality, the loss, the hunger, the pain, the danger, and complete destruction and devastation, and then are left to pick up the pieces. And that happens in any war, in every war, right? And so I think what my father certainly cautioned was that we collectively, humankind should be very careful to wish war on in any situation, right? And rather try resolve our differences peacefully.
Yes. When I was stationed in Germany, 2002, and of course, my German-based unit would deploy to Iraq for the initial invasion. I remember having some very candid conversations with many of my German friends, and they were adamantly opposed to the United States getting involved in Iraq. And at the time, I guess I can kind of relate to Villy a little bit. I was ready to go. Weapons of mass destruction, war on terror, and a lot of my German friends were just basically exhorting me to think more about this. And of course, I was a soldier. I was going to do what I was told to do, but I was also expressing a personal opinion. I think this is a good thing. I think this is going to be good for the world, yada, yada, yada. Many of them, we never talked about World War II topics. I always said that's taboo. I'm not going to talk about that with my German friends, but a couple of them just came right out and said, "Hey, listen, you should really listen to us. Like, we know what we're talking about." And
Mhm.
they would very briefly talk about the experiences of their opas, right?
Yeah.
During that time. So, yeah, it was interesting to be stationed in Germany during that time and to hear a European perspective
Yeah.
that many of my colleagues who were in the States stationed in
Yeah.
the States didn't get.
Yeah.
It was different, so it was kind of
Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah. And there's no easy answer.
No,
Yeah.
there's never an easy answer. Heidi, to wrap up, I do want to talk a little bit about you. Now, there are two things I want to touch on. The first is, as I mentioned to you earlier, my father-in-law was a Vietnam veteran and he never talked about this stuff. And we talked about, you've already talked about why that doesn't happen. Later in life, after I had, gotten scuffed up a little bit downrange in Iraq, we had a chat and he opened up about his experiences in Vietnam. And I'm pretty much the only family member that heard about what he went through. Why is it that you think, and you shared the same with Villy as well? Could you talk to a little bit about like the process of Villy kind of opening up and talking about his experiences? I know that you were pretty persistent in trying to get him to share. Like, what was that like?
Well, I remember my father waking up, or me waking up to my father screaming at night, almost every night. Obviously, he had nightmares. And when I asked, my mother would just, play it down. So, oh, no, he just suffers from nightmares, no big deal. I didn't, My dad was my dad. I had no idea, right? I didn't even realize until, I went to school and started learning about history. At some point, I connected the dots and realized, oh my God, well, my father was in the war, right? So that was just a gradual realization. And I remember at mandatory because I grew up in France. So I was in Paris at the German School of Paris, which was an expat school, Germans. We were a very small outfit. We had a mandatory field trip at age 15, and we were sent to Munich to visit the Dachau concentration camp. So that I will never forget. And I am so grateful to have had the opportunity at that young age to be exposed to, that part of history that
Mm.
was very important for me to understand. And they talk about the German collective guilt, and I have to say that it's real, and that I felt it. I felt it because that's when I started asking my father questions. I said, "Wait a minute, did you know about what happened?" And so bits and pieces, like he would start saying just very few things, not much, just enough to have the sort of family history understood and how everything was lost, and that's why there are no pictures, and no right, everything burnt down. So started piecing together things, and then I realized as an adult later on how this had to be something that my kids needed to understand.
Yeah.
So that was my biggest driver. It's like, this needs to be preserved. This suffering is universal. And in a war, everybody loses and everybody suffers. And while the experience of the Holocaust for the Jews and the Gypsies and the people who perished, all of the people who either by accident of their birth or by opening their mouths ended up being brutalized and murdered. I know those things kind of certainly diminished the German suffering, if you will, but nonetheless, it happened. And now, after so many years, it's possible to talk about everybody's experience. And I think that's important because all sides, especially, again, the people who have no choice in the matter, the children in particular, are simply victims of circumstance.
I couldn't agree more. I couldn't agree more. I mean, something that you say that really resonates with me, Heidi, is I'm from down south and I have, relatives who fought. I never met them. It's a different case, but I have family connections to the Confederacy, right? And in that legacy, today you still go to towns down south and you see statues to Confederate soldiers. And it's taken me because of all the mythology around the Confederate soldier and how proud families are that their great great grandpappy served in the Confederacy, right? And all the stories but now I view those monuments as really a liability and it's bad for the South. And it's a time that we really need to kind of turn our back on that, take down the monuments and focus on the Confederacy from a historical perspective.
Hmm.
And so, it's a different situation. I don't have direct, obviously, interaction with my relatives at that point, but now that I older and I examine things from different perspectives, it's like, yeah, I can totally understand why people hate those monuments, and it's time to take them down. We need to move forward as a society and kind of not put the past, but study the past from a historical perspective and shed the mythology. And so, what you're saying really resonates with me from that perspective.
Yeah, at one point, I think I said that war is an equal opportunity destroyer, right? It just literally it is everybody loses.
Yeah,
Um,
you were also um, a military family member.
mhm.
You married a sailor, the United States Navy,
Yes, United
and
States.
yep, and so that's how did Billy's experience and what he shared with you kind of shape how you as a military family member kind of approached conflict, your husband's service? As you and I both know, it's just not your husband's service, it's the family service. So how did you approach that? Those experiences approach shape how you viewed that?
Oh, well, very much. I remember my father. So my husband is African American.
Mhm.
And he was very concerned that my father was German, and not only German, but actually a soldier in World War II. And I remember my father's comment. He said, never said anything about my husband's color. Never. Didn't even. But he said, how could you do this to me, an American GI? Come on. And he said it as a joke. And that was that. So, he was immediately accepted into the family and, we went and had some beers at the Hofbräu house. And, yeah. Um, so that fear was immediately set aside, right? There was no concern there. And my father certainly was very supportive of my husband's service. Of
Mhm.
course, him had been a soldier himself, he understood. And he understood that it was going to be difficult for me. So he warned me. He said, this is not going to be an easy life. And I didn't know what that meant. And he was right. But yes, so we went all over the place. Our son was born on Guam. I mean, there's all the typical, deployments, especially with the Navy, the Westpacks, very long, the Gulf War, the
Mhm.
Persian Gulf War, the, Desert Storm. Our son was 4. And I remember just being absolutely terrified because he was deployed to the Persian Gulf. And then he was deployed to the peacekeeping forces. I didn't see him in almost a year.
Mm.
Um, and back then we didn't have cell phones and internet. It's the landline, and if you weren't there at that right time, you just missed the call, right?
Right.
And so, yeah, it was not easy. So I was, as many military dependents will tell the same story. I was a single mother basically for quite a while. And, we just made it happen because that's what, the circumstances demanded. And it was, yeah, I think all military families are very much in that same boat and make that sacrifice and willingly,
Yeah.
and yes, are there consequences? Yeah, absolutely. As our son especially troubles with that, with his father's absence,
Yep.
right? So that's one of the very tangible consequences. And it could happen with another profession, but so much so, especially with military, who was deployed for long periods of time.
Yep.
I mean, my daughter was very young, but she, I think, thought her daddy was a person who came to visit twice a year. And then our son, who was in his formative years, really, really did suffer from the lack of that male, figure in his
Right.
life.
Yeah. Yeah. Heidi, I think, we're at time, and I wanna make sure I respect your time. This conversation could literally go on for hours. I'm very grateful to you for many things, obviously for showing up and being our
Yeah,
guest today.
yeah,
This is a remarkable conversation, one that will stick with me forever. But I also wanna thank you for documenting Vili's experience. I think that it is absolutely essential to the study of conflict that you look at the perspective of child soldiers. I'll get in trouble for saying this. I
yeah.
think there's a special place in hell for people in power to institutionalize child soldiers for war.
I couldn't agree with you more. And I think I've mentioned to you, I have actually been approached by so many people after I wrote the book that I decided to write an anthology of 8 stories of young civilians, of kids, soldiers and civilians alike, who went through World War II and lived to tell their experiences for that reason. So I am hoping to publish that book soon. And those are oral histories. And it's in fact to preserve that oral history for people to perhaps reflect on the consequences of war.
Well, best of luck to you on that. I
Yeah.
can't wait to read it, and I would love to invite you back to be a guest again on the podcast when you roll out your book so we can talk about it. It would make me very happy. So,
Yeah, I think it's important to spread the word. It's a bit of a labor of love, but I think that's perhaps what I took out. My generational trauma is I'm turning that into a sense of responsibility to carry the stories forward.
yes, ma'am. Well, thank you for that, and thank you for your time today. Danke sehr.
Bitte
Auf
schön.
Wiedersehen.
Auf
All
Wiedersehen.
right. Thank
Bring
you.
me.
Thank you, ma'am.